I would submit that in both instances, but I'll focus on the US, this is largely because the impact of the crisis has been so different for different groups in the population. It goes back to this who's going to bear the burden of adjustment issue that I was raising before. So to understand the backdrop of this in the US, I think it's useful to remember the, I think, overwhelming social fact of the US in the past 30 or so years, which is that we know since the early 1970s, the income distribution in the US has been getting more and more unequal, for reasons that we can debate. But there's really no question that for the first 15 years of that 30 or 35 years, the bottom sort of dropped out of the labor market, and unskilled and semi-skilled workers saw their real and relative wages decline. And then for the next 15 or so years, what happened was on the top end, that is that the top 10% separated from the middle class. So there's been a deterioration of income distribution over the past 30, 35 years in the US, and unquestionably some political implications of that. Some of you may be familiar with a book by Raghu Rajan, who is an economist at the University of Chicago and a former chief economist of the IMF, called Fault Lines. And Rajan makes the argument there that effectively the crisis was the result of this deterioration in income distribution. The following scenario, he says, the Bush administration was not really willing, knew that this was a political and social problem, but was not willing to engage in active redistributive measures. So instead it encouraged lower middle class and middle class Americans to borrow in order to try to restore some of their purchasing power. Right? So this is his argument. I buy some parts of it, but not all of it. But the point is that it's widely understood by people who follow these things that the backdrop to what's happened in the past 15 or so years is a deterioration of the income distribution, and increasing problems in the bottom quarter of the labor market, and an increasing separation between the middle class and the top 10%. This deterioration of the income distribution was mitigated by the expansion that began in 2001. So the economy was growing, that overcame some of the problems. This is Rajan's argument, that the way one of my colleagues expressed it at one point during this period was comparing it with the European model, was saying, who needs a social welfare state when everybody has a credit card? Right? So in this big borrowing period, you have a certain mitigation of the social and political effects of the deterioration of income distribution. Nonetheless, we should note that the positive effects of the expansion between 2002 and 2007 were very unequally distributed. So if you divide the population into, I hate to use these terms, but that's where the numbers are, the richest 1% of American households, right, between 2002 and 2007 saw their incomes rise by 60%. The remaining 99% saw their incomes rise by 6% on average. So great inequality in distribution of the benefits of the borrowing, or benefits of the boom more generally. And of course that 6% was entirely wiped out by the crisis. The heterogeneity increases when the crisis hits. And perhaps the easiest way of seeing this is to look at unemployment. At the trough, that is the worst period of the crisis in the summer of 2000, early 2009, unemployment was approximately 10%, 9.9%, 10% in the country as a whole. Now, if you divide the labor market in thirds, the best off third, the middle third, and the bottom third, each third, if you take the workers and their dependents and so on, it's about 100 million people. So if you look at the top third, let's look at the bottom third first. The bottom third of the labor market, at the same time, national unemployment is 9.9%. The unemployment rate in the bottom third is 18%. If you then add the underemployment rate, that is people, underemployed are made up of two groups. One group is those who would like to work full-time but can only find part-time labor, which, as you know, in the US is very important because if you're a part-time worker, you probably don't have health care benefits and perhaps other benefits as well. So these are involuntary part-time workers. And another big group of the underemployed is so-called discouraged workers, that is people who have been looking for work for 2 years or more, and as a result have dropped out of the labor market, dropped out of the labor force statistically at least. So if you add the unemployed and the underemployed, at that same period, early middle of 2009, national unemployment rate is 9.9%. The unemployment rate is 18% in the bottom third. The unemployment plus underemployment rate at that point is 36%, which is near depression levels. Now look at the top third, that is households making $80,000 and more approximately. In the top third, the unemployment rate is 4%, and the unemployment plus underemployment rate is 8%. Both about double what they are in normal times, but nowhere near the same kind of crisis level as you see in the bottom third of the labor market. And that kind of heterogeneity helps explain why some Americans think the government is not doing, or thought and think, the government is not doing enough about the crisis, and others think it's doing too much. If you're in that top 1/3, you say, well, things are not necessarily so bad, certainly not bad enough to justify trillion-dollar deficits, especially since we know that we're going to be the ones paying the taxes to finance those deficits eventually. It's interesting to note, by the way, that this same kind of heterogeneity and polarization exists in Europe, but it tends, unlike in the US, to take a regional basis. So it's Germans against Greeks, it's Finns against Portuguese. In the US, it's much more, I think, sort of class or socioeconomic. We don't, it could be, there's no not logical reason, I was saying to Julian before, there's no logical reason why it couldn't be that people in Massachusetts, where I live now, Massachusetts, the unemployment rate is 6%. In Boston, it's below 5%. The housing market never went, the housing prices never went down more than 10%, and they have long since recovered. The economy is doing pretty well. Meanwhile, you have South Florida, or Nevada, or Arizona, all of which are still mired in recession-level numbers. Unemployment still above 10, maybe even 12% in some cases. 2/3 of the houses mortgages or homeowners with mortgages in Nevada are underwater. That is, their mortgages are worth more than their houses. So it could be the case that people in Massachusetts say, why should we be paying all this money to bail out those lazy Nevadans and South Floridians? Just like the Germans say, why should we be paying all this money to bail out the lazy Greeks and Spaniards and Portuguese? But, for a variety of social, political, cultural, and other reasons, Americans don't tend to think along those lines, although there was a time, like 1936, or during the Civil War, where we did. The divisions in the US, I think, are more socioeconomic than they are regional. In Europe, they're more regional than socioeconomic. Though there are regional differences in the US, and there are socioeconomic differences in Europe. Okay,